Before we start, take a moment to like and subscribe. Who was the man who would plunge Europe into darkness? Before he was a dictator, Adolf Hitler was a failed artist, a nobody rejected from art school twice, who walked the streets of Vienna in the early 20th century, dreaming of a life he would never have. His early years were a crucible of resentment and radical ideas, a period where his nationalist and anti-Semitic views hardened in the cultural ferment of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The outbreak of World War I provided him with a purpose. He eagerly enlisted in the German army, seeing the war not as a tragic conflict, but as a glorious proving ground for his ideals. He served with distinction as a messenger, was wounded, and was even temporarily blinded by a gas attack. The end of the war was not peace for Hitler, but a searing betrayal. He saw Germany's surrender and the Treaty of Versailles as a national humiliation. A dagger plunged into the heart of the nation. This burning resentment became the fuel for a new, destructive ambition, transforming the failed artist into a political fanatic with a singular mission. Returning to a broken Germany, Hitler found his voice in the small, extremist German Workers' Party. He was a master of oratory, his speeches a hypnotic mix of passionate rage and compelling promises. He spoke to the fears of a disillusioned public, blaming Germany's economic woes on Jews, communists, and the November criminals who had signed the armistice. His words, once whispered in beer halls, now thundered across Germany. After a failed attempt to seize power in the 1923 beer hall putsch, which landed him in prison, he used the time to write Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, laying out his blueprint for a new Germany. Upon his release, he set about rebuilding the Nazi Party, turning it from a fringe group into a formidable political force. He exploited the economic collapse of the Great Depression, offering a clear, if terrifying, solution to a nation desperate for hope. In January 1933, to the astonishment of the world, he was appointed Chancellor of Germany. The man who had been a nobody was now at the heart of German power. Once in power, Hitler moved swiftly and brutally to dismantle Germany's fragile democracy. The Reichstag fire in February 1933 provided the perfect pretext, blaming it on a communist conspiracy. He issued the Reichstag Fire Decree, which suspended civil liberties and allowed for the mass arrest of political opponents. This was followed by the Enabling Act, which essentially gave him dictatorial powers by allowing his government to pass laws without the approval of parliament. He consolidated his authority as Führer leader, outlawing all other political parties and establishing the Third Reich, a totalitarian state built on the pillars of absolute obedience, intense nationalism, and racial purity. He established the Gestapo, a secret police force, and created the first concentration camps for political enemies, silencing all dissent. He rebuilt the German economy with a massive program of public works, including the construction of the Autobahn and a radical military reinforcement. This defiance of the Treaty of Versailles not only put millions of unemployed Germans back to work, but also served to restore national pride and win him the adoration of many who saw him as Germany's savior from economic ruin. Meanwhile, his aggressive foreign policy began with bold, calculated moves that tested the will of Europe. He annexed Austria in 1938 in an event known as the Anschluss, and then demanded the German-speaking Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia. Each of these moves was met with appeasement from a Europe desperate to avoid another war, culminating in the Munich Agreement of 1938, where Britain and France essentially handed him the territory. But his ambitions were boundless, and appeasement only emboldened him. His invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, using the revolutionary military tactic of Blitzkrieg lightning war, finally plunged the world into World War II, a conflict that would consume tens of millions of lives. The war was more than a territorial conquest. It was a campaign to establish a new racial order in Europe. This twisted ideology, rooted in a pseudoscience of racial purity, was the driving force behind the systematic persecution and murder of millions of people, considered undesirable by the Nazi regime. The initial persecution began with a series of dehumanizing laws, most notably the Nuremberg Laws of 1935, which were not just one edict but a set of legislation designed to strip Jews of their citizenship and basic human rights. These laws prohibited marriage and sexual relations between Jews and Germans, effectively segregating Jewish people from the rest of German society and setting a legal precedent for future violence. As the regime's power grew, the oppression intensified. Jewish people were systematically segregated into crowded, squalid urban districts known as ghettos, like those in Warsaw and Lodz. These were not just walled-off neighborhoods. They were places of starvation, disease, and constant psychological terror, serving as holding pens before the next stage of the Nazi plan. The final solution was the culmination of this genocidal policy, a horrific plan for the total extermination of the Jewish population. The Nazis established a network of concentration camps for forced labor and, more chillingly, dedicated extermination camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau and Treblinka, designed solely for mass murder. Here, the process of killing was industrialized, with millions of victims transported across Europe in cattle cars and systematically gassed to death. This industrial-scale atrocity, the Holocaust, resulted in the murder of 6 million Jews, along with millions of others, including Roma, homosexuals, disabled people, and political prisoners. It remains one of the darkest and most horrifying chapters in human history, a chilling testament to the consequences of unchecked power, the dangers of a society built on hatred, and the terrifying efficiency of a state-sponsored genocide. For years, Hitler's military machine seemed unstoppable, but the tide of the war slowly began to turn. The brutal winter of the Russian campaign, the Allied invasion of Normandy, and the relentless bombing of German cities slowly chipped away at his empire. As the Soviet and Allied armies closed in on Berlin, Hitler retreated into his underground bunker, clinging to a desperate and delusional belief in a final, miraculous victory. The man who had once mesmerized millions with his powerful oratory was now a shadow of his former self, a shrunken, shaking figure lost in paranoid rants and imaginary victories. He gave orders to phantom armies, dismissed his most loyal commanders, and blamed the German people for their own defeat. In the final hours of his life, surrounded by the ruins of his ambition, he married his longtime mistress, Eva Braun. In the end, his reign of terror did not conclude with a glorious battle or a public reckoning. On April 30th, 1945, with the sound of Soviet guns echoing above, he committed suicide in his bunker, taking his own life just as the city above him crumbled. The 1,000-year Reich he had promised had lasted only a dozen years. The true twist lies not in his death, but in the chilling fact that one man, a failed artist from a troubled background, could rise to such immense power and unleash unimaginable horror upon the world. The story of Adolf Hitler is a chilling testament to the fragility of peace and the terrifying potential of unchecked power. His rise was not an anomaly, but a dire warning. The conditions that allowed him to flourish, the deep-seated economic despair, the widespread national humiliation following the Treaty of Versailles, and a society fractured by political extremism, created a vacuum into which his brand of demagoguery could pour. His story is a devastating lesson that peace is not merely the absence of war, but a delicate state that must be actively nurtured and defended. The systems of checks and balances in a democracy are its immune system, and when they fail, as they did in the Weimar Republic, the body politic becomes vulnerable to a swift and fatal illness. Unchecked power, as demonstrated by the Gestapo, the propaganda machine, and the unquestioning loyalty of many, can systematically dismantle human rights and plunge a nation into barbarism. Ultimately, the tale of Hitler's reign is a perpetual reminder of how easily a society can descend into authoritarianism, when its institutions and its people fail to stand against the insidious march of hatred and tyranny.